There have been 1,472 executions in America since
radio. My apologies. Currently, my computer is having technical issues, so I'll be recording this through my phone. Apologies for the audio spike if there's any. But with me today, I'm really excited because I'm having a longtime friend, Lucas Scott Roberts, on the show. And what I like about him is he's a very passionate advocate for Christian nationalism and the preservation of any Christian values in society. A lot of his articles are very spicy, but that's what I like about them. And what's best of all is he has a very good knack of challenging the prevailing narratives about American history while arguing that this nation is founded on Christian principles and we've drifted away from those Christian roots. So join us as we delve into the historical examples, such as King Alfred we're going to be getting into, or other great influence on English common law, and what impact Christianity has on Western civilization. So without further ado, Lucas, thanks for joining.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to have you on the show. I'm glad we were able to work it out. Apologies for all technical difficulties, but like I said earlier, this show must go on.
Yep, exactly.
So, is there anything else you want to add on about yourself before we hit the show?
Yeah, I think you hit that for the purpose of our discussion. Those are the main things. Yeah, I'm a Christian, and yeah, I feel a very particular way about Christianity and its relation to politics. And should Christians consider their Christianity when they're in the voting booth? Things like that. So I'm very different from people who are more pious, who think that we shouldn't have or care about government, things like that. So I'm very much against that type of sitting on the fence attitude. But yeah, we'll get into that more, I'm sure.
Yeah, definitely. And for the audience's record, you could find him on Twitter at addicted2Grace. Repeat one more time, at addicted2 and Grace. And that's where you could find where he writes some letters currently on Christian nationalism. And his pinned tweet is a link to all of those things. So today we're going to be covering the first 3 articles he has. So first one's your local Christian nationalist. Second, please pray for me. And third, historically Christian. So I'm looking forward to get into this. So knocking it out of the park, let's get to the first one. So my first question for you, you describe yourself as a Christian nationalist. So how do you define this term? And what are some of the core values that guide your view of this?
Yeah, so what is a Christian nationalist? First and foremost, and maybe counterintuitively, it's important to note that Christian nationalism is actually a pejorative that was created by the left to lob at Christians. And it's very important that they pair Christianity with nationalism. If you remember Donald Trump's first presidential run in 2016, Christians who came out in support of Donald Trump were called kind of this Christian fascists or Christian nationalists. So they coined that term to scare people, as including Christians, to distance themselves from people like Trump. You don't want to be one of those, because Christian nationalists, you're supposed to associate that with fascism and Nazism, right? So it's a pejorative. So why should we wear the label then of Christian nationalist if it's meant to tear us down? Well, the left has a lot of interesting tactics to help bully people into voting and acting in a particular manner. They like to call people to their right racists or homophobes or things like that. Now, I would never wear a label like racist because I don't hate anybody based on their race, right? That's what a racist is. So I would never wear that label as a way to own the left. Now, a Christian nationalist, what does that mean? It's someone who wants their nation to be a Christian nation, right? That's what the accusation is. So if somebody lobs that accusation at me, like, yeah, I do want our nation to be a Christian nation. So if we're calling that a Christian nationalist, then I'm guilty as charged, right? So I like to wear that even though it's a pejorative, I like to wear that label as a way to take that ammo out of the left's ammo box. that can't takes the sting out of it, right? It's like, no, yeah, I recognize that I live inside a nation, and I want that nation to bow the knee to Jesus Christ.
Okay, and I'm sure we're going to be talking about the left a lot, but for the audience, could you define what you mean when we're talking about the left? Are we talking about liberalism? Are we talking about like a form of progressivism? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, I leave that very, very broad, but for our intents and purposes as Christians who are politically engaged, it's people who don't want Christianity in the public sphere. So that is a wide range of people, from for the very progressive or even the communist to even the Christian who is, they're like, look, like there's I'm a Christian, but I recognize there's Islam, there's Buddhists, there's atheists, right? And I want to live in a secular nation that upholds values that we can all cherish. So for me, all of those people are to my left, right? Secularism, the idea that we could all agree to sort of religionless values and get along together. If you still believe that that's possible in 2024, like I don't know what to tell you, right? But yeah, so I say left, and it's a very, very broad brush that I paint with. If you don't want Christianity used at all in our government, then you are to the left of me.
Okay, thank you very much. And going on further for that then, do you think that Christian nationalism is exclusively a Catholic movement, an Orthodox movement, a Protestant movement? How would you define it or put it?
Yeah, I don't think it is. So with the Catholic stuff, which I'm very new to, I know there's a school of thought called integralism. It's something that I'm still learning about. When I started writing these articles, it was with my Reformed Protestant background. But I think anybody who swears allegiance to Christ, be they Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox, I think they could get behind Christian nationalism, right? If they recognize the lordship of Jesus Christ, and that belief has downstream effects into how we develop and maintain our systems of government.
Yeah, while you're saying that, it reminds me of a quote by St. Pius X, where he talks about like this whole new breed of like leftism and like modernism, where he says like, quote, modernism is the synthesis of all heresies. It is a system that is destructive of the whole Christian doctrine. It aims at the complete overthrow of the supernatural order. And that's something that's interesting, because there's lots of like, heavy hitting theologians and like priests of the 20th centuries that warn people of like the harms of like, this whole like modernist, like secularist like view where everything's just like bland.
Exactly. I think that quote really resonates with what we're talking about. There are still people today who believe wholeheartedly that our job, in terms of Christians engaging with the government, that we're supposed to, we're supposed to love our neighbor, right? So we have to do that in such a way, because secular values in a government system, that government is in charge of people who are Christians and not Christians, right? So we need a government that best is able to allow us to love everybody based on where they are. But that idea that secular values is how we apply that law, Christ's law, to love our neighbor in a secular government, that is a very, very modern idea that our Christian ancestors would be very perplexed by. And hopefully, I think people, again, would see by now, with everything that's happened, transing kids and abortion, like you see all these different conversations, and how secularism inhibits us from doing what Christ commands us to do. It's not feasible. Secular values is not a feasible way to help us love our neighbor, and that does have an effect on how we think of government.
Exactly. And I've had definitely some Catholics talk to me in private that are still trying to hold on to the ideals of, like, let's say, classical liberalism. And funny enough, I blame people like Dave Rubin and like Michael Knowles decently for this, because they try to like be like, oh, you don't have to go that far, you can be a classical liberal. And classical liberalism to me is equivalent of watching a train wreck happen and saying, let's do it again and let's do everything exactly like it was and expect different results. It's like, well, classical liberalism brought us to where we are here, so why do you want to do that again?
What you just said, what we are living today was always the end result of classical liberalism. It's not like we had a perfect system, we had this utopian system of government, and we failed to maintain it. This was always the end game. A society that has completely decoupled itself from its creator was always going to end up where we are today, right? So that classical liberalism is it was and is a fairy tale. We don't need to subscribe to that any longer.
Yeah, and unfortunately too, like, people are finally coming to that like resolution where they're taking a hard look and saying, okay, because I've heard the real liberalism hasn't been tried before, and I just laughed. I'm like, okay, you're sounding like a communist trying to say real communists haven't been tried. But
exactly.
And in a sense, though, like, there's some of them that are still trying to find a way to hold on. They're like evolving and say, okay, I'm a post-liberal now. So they're basically arguing it's not that liberalism failed, it's that liberalism succeeded, and this is the result. Like, we're looking at it, basically. So where do we go from here? And that's why... yeah, go ahead.
That's the $1 million question, right? Because most of the conversations I have, most of them agree with you. They say, yeah, this is, classical liberalism is a fairy tale. But then as Christians, they're very hesitant to make that next step and say something like, now I'm a Christian nationalist. I understand it's not the end all be all, and I'm happy to debate with people who have better ideas or think that Christian nationalism is problematic, whatever. But that's what I get frustrated with, is people are like, okay, classic liberalism is dead, but I don't know what to do. It's okay, well, we need to figure out something and we need to implement something, right? We can't just say, oh yeah, liberalism is stupid. Well, okay, then what?
Exactly. It's kind of like anyone could point out, I call it descriptive, prescriptive method. Anyone could point out the descriptive or what is the ailment. No one could point out what is the solution, or they're brave enough to do so in modern society. Like, the only places you see it are like groups like us, where you have people like you saying like, hey, we need to do Christian nationalism. Or you have groups like, shout out to the American Royalists, I interviewed them recently, where they talk about like, hey, we need integralism instead. And it's just like these different groups saying, here's where we go forward. Or even Two on Head's husband, Eudaimonia, is his account online. He's a really cool guy. He's arguing right now in favor of like post-liberalism. So it's interesting because to me, who really likes political theory, it's almost like a Game of Thrones-esque game where we're basically coming to the realization like, hey, the boomer generation is finally dying off. Where do we go from here? Because they've been holding onto the reins for a long time in this nation, where instead of them passing it on to the next generation, he's kept holding on to it. So now we're going to have a giant power vacuum saying, what are we going to do? So it's definitely an interesting time in politics to look at, especially political theory.
And as young people get more involved in leadership, which inevitably leads to political roles, these questions about how, as Christians, how do we take our Christianity into the public sphere are going to have to be answered better than that boomer generation you were referring to earlier, right? Who I think had very poor answers for, it's like, oh, we keep our Christianity at home, we keep our Bible in our dresser, and we don't take that outside of our home, certainly don't take it into the public sphere. We realize now what those decisions led to, which is what we have now. So then the question is, how do we as Christians engage with now? And there are still plenty of people who think that the problem was that we got involved at all, that the idea that we should have that Christians should be involved in government at all, which just blows my mind. But and if you want to talk about that, we can. But I'm
heard
very
people,
interested
funny enough, try to argue that Christian anarchism is the only solution. And I just look at them weird.
Anarchism,
like, nah,
or even or even the pietist that's like, look, like, Christians should not vote. They should run for public office. They should join the military. They're almost like have an Amish sort of attitude towards political endeavors, right? that's a whole swath of people. But yeah, I'm very much interested in like Christian nationalism and like how do we get Christians engaged with government? Like how should we think of Christ and our government?
No, exactly. So going back on track, some of our questions I have prepared for you. I was curious, in your view, what role would you believe Christianity play in said governments or cultural for identifying of a nation? So are you trying to say here for the audience that, hey, once we do have Christian nationalism, everyone's got to be Christian? Or are you trying to say like Christians would simply, by our laws, ethics, and virtues, we'd be able to rule better than a secular government?
So I agree with that latter part, but yeah, I would say that not everybody has to be Christian, and the church has been very clear on this question, historically speaking. We don't compel people to make a profession of faith by force. That is clearly unbiblical, and the church has been very clear that that's not okay. What I would say is there is a historical Christian, like, to make sure that our leaders are themselves Christians, right? Like, you cannot run for public office unless you are a Christian, right? That, and actually in American history, that was, you had to be, and even in particular states. So like Pennsylvania, for instance, was founded as a Quaker, so they were much more open. But in places like Massachusetts, are run by Congregationalists. Rhode Island, you had to be a Baptist in order to hold public office. Like there were different states that had different laws about you. Like you could be an atheist, you could be a Muslim, or even if you were a Christian, right? But if you were a Catholic, you wouldn't be able to hold public office in these states. Now we could argue about, and I do agree that that's one problem with Christian nationalism is like, okay, and you had kind of asked me this earlier, like, is this more like Protestant, Orthodox, Catholic, whatever? That is a bridge we're going to have to cross one day. There's not an easy answer for that. But yeah, I would say that that's one thing that we could be looking forward to as Christians is be like, look, Christians have the best system of morality. Christians, like all of the, and we can look at this historically, like all the different things that we enjoy in our society that come from Christianity. Christians gave the world all of these different institutions. It makes perfect sense to have Christians in charge of the government and to prohibit people who do not confess Christ as Lord and to exclude them from being able to serve in public office.
Yeah, the reason too, that's a very important question, is because it really boils down to like what is a Christian, because especially in American history, we had a handful of founding fathers that were Unitarians. We had a handful of historical movements too, where like it was legal battles for Mormons saying like, hey, we're Christians, when obviously like majority of people who aren't Mormon believe like they're not Christians. Same for groups like Jehovah's Witnesses. Like, what are we going to do for them? Are they going to fall in line with us? And even taking it to the extreme, like I've heard some, really into theology, like Eastern Orthodox or like some Roman Catholics would go as far as to say like some sects of Protestantism aren't even Christian, like low church of Protestantism. And American history too, I'm thinking about like the Nativist Party in the mid 19th century. They were a very anti-Catholic movement in response to the Irish and German immigrations coming to America, where they're like, oh, Catholics aren't Christian. So that's definitely going to be something that we're going to have to think about in the future. Would you propose any idea like that, or any thoughts to like what is a Christian?
Yeah, I think there's certainly been a lot of ecumenical conversations that have happened about what is a Christian. We have historical Christian creeds that people can and should subscribe to, and we would have to formulate like that. But I do think like historically confessional Christian denominations, right? Like I do think it's a problem, like people who use Christianity very flippantly, mega church type celebrity style,
Like
Hillsong type church. Yeah. Like I think it would be fine to exclude people like that and say no, that's not at all what we mean. Because I think this is really, really important. I think having government officials who are themselves subject to the church is really, really, really important. Saint Ambrose, it's this very famous example. So the mayor at one point got really angry about the neighboring town and sent soldiers and had them decimate. He changed his mind, but he didn't get to the soldiers in time, and the soldiers like pillaged this neighboring town, whatever. So he repented, right? He said, "I'm sorry, I should have done that," and he went that following Sabbath to get communion. And Saint Ambrose withheld communion. He withheld the Eucharist from him and forced him over the course of a year to go through this cycle of penance. And the mayor submitted to that. That, to me, is a perfect example of the relationship between church and government. The government's job is to vanquish evil, right? Apostle Paul makes that very clear in Romans chapter 13. It's their job to punish evil, to reward the good, right? And it's the church's job to handle ecclesiastical matters, right? The bishop doesn't tell the mayor how to do mayoral things, right? Only insofar as it has a relationship to ecclesiastical matters, right? But ultimately, that government official is responsible to Christ through the church, right? That's historically how it's been. So that's why I'd say having confessionally verified Christians who belong to confessional denominations where there is church hierarchy that keeps those government officials accountable to the law of Christ, I think is very important when we're talking about having a truly Christian nation.
No, definitely. And the reason I brought up the question earlier wasn't trying to throw you a hard ball so early in, but I just saw that as being actually a really prominent issue that we should look at, definitely, because that's always been a debate among Christianity, like what is a Christian, to the sense that some people struggle on a lot. But let me think what else. I was going to ask you another thing going further on this in regards to policy. So, one moment as I get my question ready, because I had it up earlier. Oh, in your first article, you were talking about the importance of biblical principle in shaping society. And I was wondering, how would you reconcile that with the state we are at currently, with a lot of like secularism being about modernity, if you will?
Yeah, and especially progressive Christians are really good about incorporating Christian language and flavoring it into modernist progressivism, whatever. We are charged with caring for the poor. We are charged with looking out for the widow and the orphan, right? And ironically enough, that's the reason why we have laws that protect the underserved. Those come from Christians, from churches imposing their sense of morality on their local governments. That's why we almost like the idea of human rights come from, like, no other religion says that every single human being is themselves an image bearer of the Creator, right? And because of that, they have certain inalienable rights. I understand that the Declaration of Independence and our other founding documents has language that we see a lot of progressive modernity. We see the roots of it there. But again, that's what they're doing when they say certain inalienable rights is they're plagiarizing Christianity, right? That's our idea. That's us who said that every image bearer has certain right. If you look at Mosaic law, for instance, there's so many instances where the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner was privy to the safeguards and access to justice that the Israelites had, right? It wasn't exclusive based on race. That's again another example of it being a distinctly Christian thing. So that's what I'm saying. We've really got to divorce ourselves from trying to recycle secularism, try to find the good out of it. We don't need, if anything, secularism plagiarized us. We could just go back to the roots where secularism went and where they picked the things out of Christianity that they liked. bypass secularism, go to our sources, and resurrect those ideas and principles to institute a Christian nation. We really have no need for secularism, period.
Exactly, because secularism is like a cheap knockoff of like the original stuff. And I'm curious going further to another thing I wanted to ask, because we did mention this earlier, but there are a handful of Christians that would argue that nationalism and Christianity are inherently contradictory. What would be your response to those group of people? What would you tell them?
Yeah, and I think that's a very valid point, right? Like the nation state, as we understand, is a very modern thing, and it's not in Scripture, right? What I would say is every institution, every knee must bow to Christ, right? So we live in an age full of nation states. We could argue whether a nation is the best way to organize a particular geographical society or not. You know, I'm not. I say Christian nationalist again because it was a pejorative invented by the left, and I'm taking the gusto out of their barb, right? It's not a term that I designed or a Christian designed. But yeah, I'm not beholden to the nation state. I recognize that I'm a Christian who currently lives inside of a nation, and I believe that that nation is called by Christ to bow the knee to him. So yeah, I'm not saying let's make our nation a Christian nation and let's be a nation state forever until Jesus comes back. I don't know that the nation state is the best form of government, right? I'm very sympathetic to those arguments that say otherwise, but I'm just recognizing that I currently live inside of a nation state in the same way that I live inside of a county, right? I believe that county should bend the knee to Christ. That doesn't mean that I think a county is the best for you know what I mean? Like, it's whatever our institutions are, nation states, counties, school boards, whatever, nonprofits, all of them should bow the knee to Christ.
Sounds good. And one more question I want to ask before we move on to your next article, but what are some things you envision as the ideal role of Christian nationalism in shaping the future of our nation?
Well, the biggest benefit obviously would be the abolition of abortion. It's still, even with the Roe versus Wade being dissolved, because of COVID, there was a lot of mail-in abortion pills, right? That became a lot more accessible during it. So even in states where abortion was abolished, those women are still able to access abortion pills and to kill their children, right? So that's just one very obvious benefit of having a Christian nation, is stuff like that we've been fighting for forever. We would actually be able to criminalize. There's other things too, like, and I don't want to side rail our conversation too much, but I think limited liability as an institution is one of the more pernicious forms of capitalism that we have today. And that's when people talk about crony capitalism, or unfettered capitalism, where people could do whatever. Well, a lot of the reason why we see so much corruption is because of ideas like limited liability, where because I organize myself under a particular banner, in this case limited liability, I limit the amount of liability that I would normally have if I were to engage in similar behavior without that banner. That's what allows giant corporations to poison. They could dump pollutants in the river, right? They could take care of that cost because their liability towards that is limited, just for the simple fact that they belong to a limited liability corporation. I don't, especially when I talk to Christian libertarians, they really don't like this idea because, for a lot of reasons. But what I would say is mercantilism, which is what we had prior to this sort of laissez-faire capitalism that we really got going in the 19th century. We had plenty of mercantilism, capitalism, where people were fully liable for their actions, and people were able to access the justice system. Which, and I don't want to ramble too much, but that's what I think is the most important thing. What makes a really society healthy is having access to justice. When a society does not have access to justice, especially when the widow, the orphan, doesn't have access to justice, that is a very sick society. That access to justice is becoming more and more limited. And in a Christian nation, that because in the Bible, the Old Testament, God spent so much time chastising Israel, not for keeping kosher, not like there were times when he addresses those things, but more than anything else, it was the underserved, the poor that were overlooked, that didn't have access to justice, that our current system not promotes, but just kind of allows it to happen. And if you're a rich person who is able to access a limited liability entity, right, you have much more freedom, more ability to get away with things that the poor doesn't have, right? That doesn't mean we have to go be full communist, socialist, whatever. That's no. There's a Christian way to answer this problem, and you could start with having accessible systems of justice.
If you don't mind me asking, are you familiar with something called distributism?
A little bit, yeah. I know. I think that's more of a.
That's more like G.K.
Catholic idea.
and yeah,
Okay.
Belloc Carrion, like guys like that. He wrote a lot about it.
Well, it's like I mentioned
It
before.
it sounds vaguely familiar
that
to what
I'm
you're
learning.
describing. Yeah, that's what I was asking.
Yeah, I've got a lot more reading to do, but I'm certainly not the first person to think about these things. It's interesting that it sounds like the church has thought and written a lot about these very things. So I know I'm not alone.
Yeah, there's a lot of. Funny enough, the church has a pretty heavy roster when it comes to economists, and that's been dating back for centuries now. But if you're okay, we're going to go ahead and pivot over to the next article we have in store. Reading through this one, I liked it a lot. So are we going to have a state church is how you open it, and you follow with, can I get arrested for mowing my lawn on Saturday or Sunday? And are Baptists going to get drowned again? That's something I found to be a bit amusing, but
there's a historical precedent for that, because there were Presbyterian states that did drown a couple Baptists for refusing to agree to infant baptism. So yeah, it's I did write that in a funny way, but yeah, there is actually, sadly enough, there is a historical precedent for that.
Yeah, and going further down the article, I found something interesting when you were talking about your thoughts on, the pessimistic Christians case against like this. And you're thinking like, okay, why though? And I'm going to read a short passage really quick here that you have where you say, here's a better question. What if God's impending judgment is in fact coming, and the first group God's going to punish is his own people? And you followed it up with, the American church is largely apathetic towards affecting public morality. There's a lot of reason for this apathy. Personally, I blame Ron Paul. The libertarian idea, whatever you do with your body is your business, was not a conservative conviction until the 2000s. I appreciate Paul's efforts to focus on conservatives, ending endless wars and enabling fiscal responsibility, but gay marriage would not have happened without libertarians pretending that the more conservatively correct posture was to stay out of it. That line was actually really good, and I enjoyed that, because for people who know, for the longest time, I myself tried to hold on to juggling, my Catholic faith and the centuries of theology behind that with, me holding on to libertarianism. And it wasn't until I really delved into like both the NAP and what is consent-based morality that I realized it was a very pagan thought that was based on like Epicurus. And that's something that eventually helped me get out of that. But what are your thoughts when you were writing that portion?
In many ways, it was very cathartic, because I too am a former libertarian. For a long time, my Twitter profile read that I was a recovering libertarian. I was deeply affected by Ron Paul and his presidency. I supported him a lot in his 2012 presidential run. I even made phone calls on behalf of his presidential campaign. I was very much on the Ron Paul libertarian train. What's really funny is, so 2010, right? The Oberfeld decision by the Supreme Court that had this downstream effect about the legalization of gay marriage. And I remember, still being kind of a lukewarm Christian, whatever. And I was having a conversation with my mother, and she was very, very concerned about the legalization of gay marriage. She said, if they do that, then they're, pedophilia and like all these other crazy forms of depravity they're gonna start forcing those to be normalized. And I said, Bob, you're just being weird and crazy and old. That's the slippery slope fallacy. So like the slippery slope fallacy means what you're saying is wrong. And since I've had that, I've apologized to my mother several times because she was absolutely correct. I mean, look, isn't that exact? Everything that they said was going to happen is happening. The forms of depravity that they're trying to normalize, right? And this wouldn't have happened if we did let go on gay marriage. And again, the libertarian idea sounds very nice. Like, hey, to each their own. Like, if as long as they're doing it on their property, like, why should it affect you? That's not a Christian idea. And again, that wasn't the goal. That wasn't the goal for them to do it in their own. Like, that agenda is that in the state of Washington and the state of California. If your child decides that they're going to transition and they're not comfortable telling you about their transition, their teachers are legally protected to help transition them without having to inform you, right? I mean, that happened in such a short. We went from gay marriage in 2010 to your children being transitioned behind your back, but in a very, very short period of time. That's crazy.
First of all, too, in Australia, the education system there is legally allowed to. Let's say you have like a 12-year-old kid who says like, Daddy, I think I'm a girl when it's a boy. And like, well, no, you're a boy. You're not a girl. He could go to his teacher and tell them that. And if the school board deems it as being, unaccepting parenting, they'll view it as abusive. And they have like the legal right in Australia to take your child from you. Yeah. And you'll simply lose your 12-year-old kid now. And then, the state has like ownership over the kid. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, that's horrible.
It's horrible. It has to be like that. But what's crazy is how conservatives were very cuckolded during that period, where we adopted this libertarian idea of, well, hey, as long as they're not hurting everybody, as long as all the parties are consenting, right? And that hamstrung us to help affect true Christian morality on society at large. And we're paying the price for it now. One of the things I follow a lot of detransitioner accounts. So these are people who, and a lot of them transitioned when they were teenagers, right? They weren't even fully grown adults, but they felt that they were having these certain feelings. They needed to transition, right? They're having all these problems. And the solution they were offered was, well, you were born in the wrong body. They were given this trans gospel that said, once you transition to your true, authentic self, then you'll find true happiness. And unfortunately for them, by undergoing irreversible surgical and chemical alterations, they found that trans gospel to be false. And again, how did this happen? How did we get to where they even have access to do this to themselves as children? How did we do that? Because conservatives, because Christians listened to libertarians and allowed the left to define our sexual morality. That's how we got to where we are today.
I mean, worst of all, too, and I'm not that big of a fan of Matt Walsh, but I remember when he did that documentary, What is a Woman, a few years ago, and something that I found very shocking, he ended up interviewing, I believe it was a gender therapist. I didn't even know that was an actual field of career. And he was talking to that individual, and it slowly dawns on you that this person, their only job that they were doing was basically just reaffirming, like a confused, scared, like teenagers, what they are, teenagers, They're like, oh, actually, you are right. You are really a woman on the inside. You should do like these surgeries. And I'm like, how is that any professional role or doctor? You're just paying someone to, in a way, just like coax you into something that's obviously not true. Like, imagine if I opened up a clinic, for example, and you come in there and you're saying like, hey, you know, I feel like there's something crawling in my skin. I don't know what it is. A normal, like, you know, psychiatrist would be like, well, you're clearly mentally unwell, get you help. But the clinic I'm operating, I could simply be like, well, you know, Lucas, what if there are bugs under your skin? What if they are in there right now? Like, how is that? That's the madness to me. How is that, you know, actual taking care of your patient? That's just reaffirming something that's clearly wrong and not true, you know?
Exactly. And again, we do better. We do better, but the left has always been pushing this type of sexual revolution stuff. But the conservatives wouldn't have given in so quickly had they not decided that libertarians were correct about sexual morality, and we're paying the price for it today.
Okay. 100% agreement with you on that one, though. And one more thing I wanted to ask. So, in your article, you were talking about the apathy of the American church towards affecting morality. In your view, what steps do you believe Christians should be taking to address this apathy and promote moral values in society? So, what are the steps we should be taking?
I think the church needs to be convicted about her role to affect government policies. Most people, be they, and I've seen this attitude, be they Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox, I've seen them say things like, Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. Or a lot of people are like, look, we were told that things were going to get really bad at the end, right? So things are getting really bad right now, so hey, maybe it's the end. You know, if Christians threw up their hands every time things got bad because they, that's the sign of the times, the end's right around the corner. The end has been right around the corner for multiple times throughout history, right? Like, if you remember the Black Death, where people were dropping like flies, yeah, there was really good reason to believe that the end was near. That obviously didn't happen. We can't just throw our hands up in the air and say, well, things really suck, so I guess this is how God wants it to be. No, it's not how God wants it to be. But
Exactly.
God is more than happy to give us, like, it's like, okay, you guys don't want to fight for anything. You want to let your neighbors mutilate each other, murder each other with abortion. You want to let this happen, and you're going to sit on your butt and do nothing, then I will give you exactly what you deserve. And he will hold that. And that's what you brought this up a little bit earlier when I said, if God were to bring judgment to America, the first group of people he's going to judge is his church. People who have sat on their ass, did absolutely nothing, and allowed secularism to ruin society. And what really makes me angry is that our society was formed by centuries of Christendom, of people who, convicted by their Christianity, formed the very types of government that we have today, right? A right to a jury of your peers. That's a distinctly Christian idea. Property rights, human rights, or even like, hospitals, libraries, like all these things come from Christianity. And the descendants of those Christians are giving all of those things away for nothing. I think if we were to be judged by God today, I mean, like, we're talking like Sodom and Gomorrah levels. Like, we were given, like, just think of all the different things that we get to enjoy that people in any other time period would just blow their mind. All the different things you and I get to enjoy on a regular daily basis. We don't appreciate it. We don't fight for it. We give them to, we give these institutions to people who hate God, and then we get upset when they use them against us, when they destroy them. it's because we're not fighting for it. It's not because God wants America to look the way that it does right now. It's because the church has done nothing to fight for the things that we were given and just gave away.
Exactly. And I liked how you brought up Sodom and Gomorrah, because in the article you did make reference to the story of Jonah and the city of Nineveh as an example of repentance leading to divine mercy. And I liked how, as you were talking, I was thinking, okay, how is Lucas here going to envision a modern day revival that could prevent this from happening? Like, where is going to be our divine mercy? And like, how are we going to be able to repent, if we've gone this far? Because that's exactly what happened to the city of Nineveh. It was full of like degeneracy and debauchery and like absolute disgust and depravity, to the point where even Jonah thought, God would like smite the city and eradicate it, but he didn't. He showed mercy. And that's something I've always thought about. But you have any comment on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, with Jonah, because people are, another reason why they throw their hands up is they like, well, look how bad it is. Like, there's just no way. Like, what you brought up with Jonah is a perfect case in point. Like, actually, there's societies that were even more depraved, believe it or not. And in one round of, and Jonah didn't even want to be there. He didn't even want to preach to them. But he preached the gospel and they repented and turned. Like, God could move on this country if we wanted him to. I don't want to be salacious, because I say that it's like, well, do we want to? And Sola, I don't know that we do. I don't know if we want God to move in this country. I think we like not being in control. We like not having responsibilities. We like having things bad, because then we're like, well, I can't do anything. Like, I'm not in control, and I'm not making the bad things happen. I'm just a victim. We have this victim mentality that we do not want to get rid of, because we don't want to bear any responsibility for helping to build Christendom and to spread the gospel and to spread the church. We'd rather...
And right, you nailed that on the head right there too, with like the whole thing of victimhood mentality. And that's the reason why victimhood mentality is so prevalent and hard to let go. Because if you're a victim, you don't have to take any responsibility for anything. Like, you see that where even like Martionists try to redefine the word racism, where like, oh, racism is really power plus prejudice, whatever bullshit. And they're doing that so they could maintain a victimhood status while also just plainly being racist, to be blunt about it.
Right, exactly. But again, Christians aren't getting in the line of fire. We're not getting in the gap. We get exactly what we want. We get exactly what we deserve. And until we change, until we repent and say, no, this is wrong, and I'm going to get in and fight to stop this, right? God's just going to keep letting the pagans be pagans and giving them over to, like in Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 1, he's going to continue to let them over to their depraved mind and join their debauchery, because we're not stepping up to do anything about it.
Exactly. And another thing I wanted to ask you before we move on is, you mentioned, I'm trying to find it exactly. Oh, here it is. So you mentioned that Christians need to repent for their idolatry and disregard for God's law. And I was curious what you meant in regards to like idolatry, and because we've spoken a lot on God's law, but what do you mean by that in particular?
Yeah, so where we hold different things in higher regard than we do for God. So we've talked a lot already about secularism. We need to uphold secular principles in order for us to have the best form of government that allows us to love our neighbor like we're supposed to. But the problem is that secularism isn't in the Bible, and we're upholding the principles of secularism as an idol, right? God has given us his principles. God has given us his laws about how governments should be organized and run. If we're going to replace that with something else, if we're saying no to God, or say no, like you have this, like, we appreciate, there's all these things in the Old Testament, they're kind of archaic and weird, and we're much more enlightened now, and we're going to use these secular principles instead. and we're going to uphold them. We're going to fight for them. That's just classic idolatry, where we've replaced the God thing with the man thing, and we worship and uphold the man-centered thing over what God has given us to cherish and uphold.
And I definitely, too, when you mention that, I agree with what you're saying. But one thing I'd also add on, and this is one of my personal gripes with, or worries with Christian nationalism, I'd be interested in hearing your answer to. But I am nervous that if this was implemented, you would see more of a fusion between the Americanism and like Christianity. And what I mean by that, as an example, is like I have a very close friend from military. He at the time invited me to go to his church he's been attending, and it's a Southern Baptist church. And I remember going in there, and the first thing you see while walking through a door is a giant painting of Christ, but he's draped around an American flag. And that's what I mean, in a sense where it's almost like idolatry of, Christ, where I'm like saying like, no, Christ isn't just, exclusive to like one country. He's the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. And I was curious, picking your brain, do you see that as a genuine concern, or how would you respond to that?
For sure. I think, we could definitely place America over God. In fact, a lot of well-meaning Christians have done exactly that. When you were describing that picture, what came to my mind as a much better painting of what I think Christian nationalism would be is if you took a picture of, say, George Washington, or just pick your favorite founding father, and they had a American flag wrapped up like in the triangle, like an appropriate, right? You were in the military, you know what I'm talking about.
Yep.
And they were bowing before Christ. So Christ is sitting in his throne, and George Washington is bowing. He's on the knee. He's got his head bowed and is offering the American flag to Jesus. About.
There's another one I really like where it's Christ and he's walking and he's draped in, where he's wearing the white and gold basically, and he's going 4 fingers of light above him. And amongst him are soldiers from all across the world, different nations and time periods, and they're all putting their weapon down, they're kneeling and bowing to him. And you have soldiers from World War II, soldiers from the Revolution, everyone's just like kneeling before Christ. And that's the really powerful image.
I love that. I think that's what I think of when I think of Christian nationalism. Not, bang up, America, but no. I want it to, because America will only thrive as much as it bows the knee to Christ, right? So having American symbols and showing homage to American men and women, people of honor, whatever, who God has ordained to be his minister, like what he says in Romans 13, civil magistrates who are his ministers to punish evil. Yeah, I'm totally cool with giving them the respect and honor that they deserve, with the understanding that that honor and glory that they get is a reflection of Christ's glory as the King of the universe. They only have that in a Christian nation. They only have that power and prestige because Christ is king, not the other way around.
Exactly. And there's a very beautiful, it's an old painting too, and I can't recall the context off the top of my head of it, but it's in regards to George Washington, where it's him getting off his horse and he's taking a knee outside in the woods and he's praying. And do you know what picture I'm talking about? It's a really old but like famous like portrayal of Washington, where it's like him praying.
Oh yeah, Valley Forge.
Yes, Valley Forge. Thank you. That's a very good picture of him. And I miss, between me and you, like I miss having a leader that we could have pride in, if that makes sense. I'm tired, election after election, being embarrassed, being ashamed of like our representatives, of like people in politics, of our own president.
Well, and again,
it's just shameful, like, and embarrassing to be like, wow, Biden's running this. Okay, here we go. Like,
because we don't, as a Christian voting bloc, we don't really work together to promote Christian political candidates. So that's why we end up in that situation where we're like, man, like Biden and Trump, Like, how did we get here? Because of decades of us doing nothing. The last time that Christians really banded together to try and do a more Christian American government was actually back in the 1980s. Jerry Falwell, the moral majority, that whole movement, it was called the moral majority, but funny enough, they were actually in the minority. Jerry Falwell was a Southern Baptist, and he was mercilessly attacked by other Southern Baptists for his political engagement. Billy Graham is another one who came under fire. Because Christians are more hesitant to talk about politics, that's how it's not because people haven't tried. It's every time they do, Christians throw them to the wolves. And if something doesn't work out, see, that's what happened. It's his kingdom is not of this world. Remember, we're not supposed to be doing this. And that's what you get for trying to, do political stuff.
It's such a cop-out, too, when they say that. It's like,
yeah,
I'm sorry, but I'm not going to settle for someone who's Catholic in name and loan with dementia and a guy who was sleeping with porn stars and was, known as, loan sharking people when he was a business tycoon. I don't think either of those options represent Christianity. And unfortunately, you see with the MAGA crowd, they have almost this cult-like worship of Trump. It's really strange and bizarre, but
for sure. So then you end up in the lesser of two evil dilemma, which maybe we could do that for a future conversation if you want to. But that whole lesser of two evil dilemma would happen if Christians would take our political considerations seriously. But because we've
the lesser of two Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Well, just because we phoned it in for so long, that's how we have this lesser of two evils thing. But yeah, that's all.
Yeah, the lesser of two evil analogy really evolves into the frog in the pot of water analogy, where you just gradually, slowly over turns, keep turning the temperature up and up and up, and the frog doesn't notice until eventually it's boiling and it's too late. Where you keep just accepting lesser of two evil, and then the can just get worse and worse. But all right, let's see. Go on to your final article and the one I was looking forward to the most. So this one is getting more into history, and I'm actually going to be enjoying this a bit. So let me see. Where's the certain passage I was enjoying reading? Here it is. So you say in this article right here, quote, freedom of speech, human rights, women's rights. These are a few of the many benefits that we in the West have taken for granted. A right to a jury of your peers, right to silence. All of these pillars of Western heritage come to us solely because our Western ancestors themselves submitted to the lordship of Jesus Christ. Yet many of us don't know that these principles come from the Bible, or worse, they believe that these principles come from the Enlightenment. That right there is something I enjoy a lot, and it kind of touches on what we were bringing up earlier, being hey, a lot of these post-Enlightenment ideals, they actually came from somewhere, and it's Christian ethics. And that's something I really enjoyed a lot in that. Do you want to expand on that further?
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, I'm sure all of us have heard, it's almost a meme, right? Our nation was founded on Christian principles. But even people who say that, if you were to ask them, oh, what do you mean? More often than not, answer you again is well, our founding fathers were Christians. Like you pointed out earlier, that's kind of, there were some Unitarians in there and some Freemasons. We could talk about how influential Freemasonry was on the founding of America, blah, blah, blah. We certainly don't think we don't think pre-America. We don't think, sometimes we think of the Pilgrims, but even then, that's maybe the extent of what we think of as the Christian foundation of our country. So you have that extreme, or you're well, actually, our ideas of a republic, a democracy, they all come from the Enlightenment. It doesn't actually come from Christianity. So that's patently false, but the former is only half the story. Our Christian heritage in the West goes back even farther. So I spend a lot of time in this article you referenced talking about King Alfred the Great. When we talk about a Christian prince who used the Bible to enforce Christian laws. I don't think there's a better example than King Alfred the Great, who, for whatever reason, he's reached sainthood in the East. He is not in the West yet been canonized as a saint.
Okay. And let me think what else. We should canonize him as a saint. Hint, hint. I'm not trying to drop any. But
Yeah, and I can make the art case for why he's really the chief cornerstone for why we have a Christian nation today, in principle at least.
yeah, I was actually, that's the question I was going to ask in a sense. And
Yeah. So King Alfred, this is like the 9th century England. So he was the first king of a unified England. Before then, there were particular sections of England that had different kings. He was able to defeat the Viking horde and Christianize the entire nation. How did he do that? So he accomplished quite a few different things. People think the first person to translate the Bible into English was William Tyndale. It was actually King Alfred the Great, not the whole Bible, the 4 Gospels and 50 of the Psalms he translated into English. He also created the Dube book. So in Old English, Dube meant judge or judgment. So the Dube book was his law book that he and his advisors developed to help judges in England go about judging their citizens. So in the preface of this Dube book, King Alfred puts a translation of Exodus chapters 20 and 21. Now, if you know what those chapters are, that contains, among other things, the 10 Commandments, right? Exodus chapter 20 has the 10 Commandments. So there's this translation of Exodus 20 and 21, and then King Alfred includes a commentary explaining why he felt that he, as a Christian leader, needed to use the Bible to make English laws. What was really funny, Sola, when I was doing research on this, most of the historical sources, which are secular, spend a lot of time downplaying King Alfred's Christianity. They briefly mention this preface, this translation of Exodus 2021 in his commentary, and they only pay lip service to what he says. They're like, yeah, he happened to be Christian, but really a lot of the laws that he had have pagan origins. And, the Christianity thing was kind of a side, whatever. That's not what King Alfred said. If you take King Alfred at his word, his explanation of why he used the Bible to make English laws, he has a lot of really important things to say that blow apart the secular historian argument that Christianity was not important to him.
Yeah, definitely. And King Alfred, honestly, we could do a whole different conversation on him because he's such an interesting character. But he is very influential in a lot of historical things, especially within Christianity and law. But something I wanted to ask you as well, you had a criticism and you called it the Enlightenment mythos. Do you want to elaborate more to the audience what the Enlightenment mythos is?
Yeah, just that, so to the people who say, oh, we were founded as a Christian nation, and what they mean is that, oh, I know that some of our founding fathers were Christians, right? So people who know a little bit more about history will say, actually, the Enlightenment is where we get our ideas from. Democracy, republic, and alienable rights. Those are actually Enlightenment ideas developed by people who were themselves divorced from the superstition of religion. When you look at King Alfred the Great, who was a deeply convicted Christian, several centuries before the Enlightenment, right? 6-7 centuries beforehand. And that's where we get a lot of these principles from that you and I use today. We talked about earlier, secularism plagiarizes Christianity when it suits their purposes. So the Enlightenment mythos, this idea that actually it's the Enlightenment that gave us secularism, so we can't disparage secularism and the Enlightenment, otherwise we wouldn't have a democracy or we wouldn't have a republic or whatever. Not that democracy is something worth saving anyway. That's a whole separate conversation.
Amen to that.
But Yeah, like, but that Enlightenment mythos is sort of in the same way that Bible and Christianity are like important foundational pillars for the Christian psyche. What I call the Enlightenment mythos is this faith-based assertion that the Enlightenment gave us these wonderful ideas about human rights. It's just simply not true. And you look at the French Revolution, which was the culmination of the Enlightenment, and see how bloody it actually was, how little they cared about human rights, just to see that it's not, forget American Revolution and postmodernism and everything else. Just go to the first physical manifestation of the Enlightenment mythos to see that it's all nonsense. So yeah, that's what I meant by that term.
No, definitely. And going further in a bit more, you were again going at your critics of Christian nationalism, and you were touching on more of the topic of like, hey, some say it's a personal experience. My relationship with Christ is personal. It's not a religion. How do you try to address that as best you can for the people who do still hold on to those notions?
Yeah, does your Christian convictions have other effects on your life, right? Other than just how you personally think and feel. Does Christ command his followers to live a certain way? Does Christ command his followers to engage with their neighbors in a particular way? Yes, he does. And we also have 2,000 years of church history to demonstrate what that relationship should be like. And we should be imposing our morality on others. Now, that sounds very ethnocentric and racist and blah, whatever modernist pejorative people want to throw at me. But that's, if you're a Christian, in some semblance, you believe that the morality that you have comes from God, the Creator, in whose image you and your neighbors have been made in. God has given you scripture, church, tradition, all these different tools to help you and your neighbor live in a society that allows you to love each other the way that God commands you to. And you're going to keep that personal? You're going to keep that at home? You're not going to preach the gospel? You're not going to, like, there's other things that, like, does Bible have something to say about abortion? Like, I keep bringing up the abortion thing because I think it just makes it very clear where we should be at. I was actually having this conversation with somebody who actually happened to be Orthodox, who was telling me that, Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. We need to love people no matter who they are and what they do. And so I used the example of abortion. And it's like, well, so what is the appropriate response to someone who commits an abortion? I was like, yeah, somebody who kills their child, capital crimes for capital punishment. And I understand the Catholic Church, right, when we talk about capital, but that's a whole. I'm not trying to open that can of worms right now. But what I'm saying, if just looking at scripturally, like God's law, without any other context, capital crimes deserve capital punishment, right? Your unborn neighbor doesn't have the ability to wait for their would-be murderer to respond to the gospel. They need you to protect them so that they are afforded their inalienable rights that God has blessed them with. You can't take your Christianity and just keep it at home. That's not loving your neighbor. Your unborn neighbor especially desperately needs your Christian convictions in the public sphere. What's that?
Very, very beautifully said. I was just saying.
Oh, thank you.
100% agree with all of that, and we need honestly more of that, but that's a different conversation for a different day. So I actually have a question from a certain someone that we're both familiar with, if you don't mind us going to that.
Yeah, not at all.
So we have a question from Become a Saint, and he wants to know for you, he said, Lucas, how can democracy be compatible with Christian nationalism?
It
How would
doesn't.
you want
It does. Just stop. Stop. No, it's yeah. I mean, if we're looking at it scripturally, monarchism is, and I would actually argue constitutional monarchy is the most biblical, right? So you have the example of Deuteronomy. There was a law where once Israel had a king, once that king was coronated, they had to write by hand themselves the entire Mosaic law. The idea was they understood that their kingship existed insofar as it was God's gift to them, and they were accountable to God for their kingship. So I think constitutional monarchy, you could argue, is the most scriptural form of government that you can make. Like I said before, Christian nationalism, like I'm not beholden to the nation state, I'm not beholden to democracy, I'm not beholden to the republic. Whatever institution we have, whatever form of government we have, that needs to bow the knee to Christ. So to answer that question more head on, I would say in order to run for public office, like we were talking about earlier, you need to belong to a confessional Christian denomination. And the reason, because you need to be accountable to a group of elders regarding your role as a Christian and as someone who's in a governmental position, that you're accountable to somebody regarding the state of your soul. So that if we have to have democracy in the Christian nation, it would be with that restriction put into place.
All right, thank you very much. And another question I have in from anonymous guest, he wants to know, Lucas, what was your first introduction to Christian nationalism, and how has your view of it changed over time?
I think it was definitely a Twitter thing. So Dusty Devers is an Oklahoma state senator. He is a card-carrying Southern Baptist. I was able to interview him to talk about it. That really helped push me over to where it was like, okay, I was already done with libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism and conservatism, but I didn't really know like what's the correct political ideology for a Christian to have. And Christian nationalism, I sort of discovered this group of people who were like, no, let's, this pejorative that people are lobbing at us about trying to make fun of us for taking our Christian ideas into the public sphere. Yeah, well, that's exactly what we are doing and we should be doing. That spoke a lot to me. So that's how I found out about it. Was, there were other. I did not coin the term. I did not start the movement. I definitely got in later, and I'm very supportive of the people who like Dusty Devers has done so much to, he's had like the Rolling Stone do hit pieces on him because they're so concerned about his Christo-fascism, whatever. So,
oh, sorry, I was muted. I was saying yes, whatever buzzword you're trying to throw in today. But another question I'd like to ask you is, what is something that you would like to tell to a Christian who is unfamiliar of what this is? Like, let's say this is their first time hearing it. What's the first thing you tell them? Would you tell them to like check out any political theorists, any writers, any like certain influence of like church fathers, anything like that?
So, and that's what I'm working on, is bolstering my understanding of the church's historical answer to this question. What we've talked about so far is very surface level, right? Keith Alfred, I think, is a great example of a historical answer to the question of Christians in the public sphere. But what I would say to somebody who's interested in a Christian who's interested in Christian nationalism, I would humbly submit that the articles you referenced are very, I wrote them in such a way where they're very readable, they're very quick, they're easy to understand. But really, at the end of the day, like, I want Christians to be more Christian if that means you vote with a deeper conviction about pro-life issues, great. Or, like, let's say somebody has been really debating about, like, I really want to run for the local school board, but I don't know if Jesus really appreciates, his kingdom is not of this world, whatever. Like, I want more Christians to get involved in local, state, and federal politics. The sexualization of our children starts and stops at the local level, right? Your school board is the one who's approving these materials. It would be great if we had deeply convicted Christians standing in the gap at these local levels to help protect Christian kids and non-Christian. Like, non-Christian kids don't need to see this stuff, and they're being hit with it because we're not standing in the gap protecting them. So that's ultimately the goal, is not that everybody becomes a Christian national political theorist. I just want people who are Christians to feel like they have a license to take their Christianity into the public sphere. That's why I talk about it, why I wrote those articles. I want people to be unabashedly Christian in the public sphere.
All right. And is there any other comments you want to have for the audience at all on anything like that? Any closing remarks?
Just if check out the articles, but yeah, like, and if somebody listens to this and they're like, you know what, you're right, I have been feeling like I want to run for the mayor's office, or I want to run for school board, and if this helped you think about that a little more clearly, let me know. I'd love to know that, because what we were talking about earlier, if God were to bring judgment to America today and bring that judgment first to his people, the church, right? Your efforts to bring Christianity in the public sphere, I think, is, if you truly fear God, that's one of the best ways you could show that deference to him and his majesty, is by bringing those convictions into the public sphere in that way. So,
all right, thank you very much. And hey, this has been a very enjoyable interview. I always love talking about this stuff like that. And I know you're pretty big on Twitter Spaces, where you like to talk about it a lot. But one more thing I want to ask: where can people find you at on your socials? Like, I gave you a shout out.
Yeah, Twitter's my big one. I don't have Facebook anymore. I try to keep it just Twitter. So at addicted2grace. So at addicted to grace. You follow me. You find my pinned tweet where I have those articles you referenced. Yeah, that's, if people want to connect with me, that's where I would point them to.
Oh, we have an interesting response. 1 minute. That was going to wrap it up, but we actually got a pretty good question in. So, hello from the American Royalist. I am looking forward to listening to this episode over Christian nationalism. Would you ever be interested to hold a friendly conversation / debate on Christian nationalism and integralism?
Yes.
That'd actually be interesting. And the
So
American Royalist, yeah, they're great guys too. I have nothing but respect for them. Really solid dudes.
So what would the debate? What would be the proposition we argue it? I guess would be my next question.
I guess it'd be like, what's better for the nation, like, integralism or Christian nationalism, because they are very distinct thoughts. But
Sure.
Honestly, we talk about that more offline then, because I have to give that person. That sounds interesting. Like, I wouldn't mind posting that, because both of them, I think, are solid in their own ways.
Yeah. I guess, I'm glad you brought it up. Let me make this my last comment. I don't think Christian nationalism is an end-all be-all. It's certainly not a complete political philosophy. It's at the end of the day, when you boil it down, it is a very simple answer to a very simple question. Should Christians get involved in the public sphere with their Christian convictions? Christian nationalism says absolutely yes. What that ends up looking like next year, 10 years from now, 100 years from now, I have no idea, right? There may not even be nation states, and that's fine. Like, I don't want Christian nationalism to be like, we have to uphold. Yeah, like we don't need to be nation states forever because of Christian. No. It's, should Christians take their Christian convictions into the public sphere? The answer is yes.
No, definitely. Yeah. And like I said, it's been a pleasure having you on my show. And honestly, I'm actually glad, because I think I planned to had you on months ago when I first asked you, and then I saw an availability slot in the schedule. I'm like, all right, yeah, I definitely want to throw him on there. But it's been a pleasure having you on, Lucas. I really enjoyed your company.
Yeah, it's been really appreciate the questions and let me really air out these thoughts. I really, really appreciate that. Thank you.
Oh, one more thing I want to ask. I know you said you're writing. Are you writing any big projects at the moment that you'd like to share with the audience? Is there anything you're cooking, working on?
Yeah, if you go to my Twitter profile, I have a free ebook called Anti-NGMI Mindset. NGMI is acronym for Not Gonna Make It. So it's not a Christian nationalist topic. It's something else I'm passionate about is young Christian men who don't feel like they're able to use their voice in a leadership role, be that at work or in church or whatever. They just don't feel like they have the ability to lead confidently and to speak publicly. The book is to help give those guys the mindset that I think is best equips them to undertake that. And I'm trying to, in the future, I'm going to have a course where in 8 weeks, I'm going to be able to take you from I'm too scared to talk in public to being a good public speaker in 8 short weeks. So that's all stuff I'm trying. But the book that you can find on my Twitter profile link, it's free. Anybody can access it. If people want to read that and give me feedback, I'd appreciate it.
Definitely. And it's been a pleasure having you on as well. Well, this has been another episode of Requiem Radio, and we're getting close to wrapping it up on season 3. We already pre-recorded the season finale, so by the time this gets published, we should be on hiatus and on our way to season 4. Looking forward to season 4. We're going to start doing roughly 20 episodes per season, and we're expanding a lot on a lot of things. So going to have bigger guests, bigger topics. It's going to be tons of fun. But thank you again, Lucas, for being on our show. And this is Sola Requiem. Thank you for tuning in to Requiem Radio.